Welcome, everyone. I'm Martin Baily, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I've been working for the last several years with Ben Harris of Northwestern University, who is Northwestern University's Kellogg School, and he also has a Brookings connection, to understand the challenges of retirement in a world where private sector pensions have largely disappeared. We have had a series of events. This that you're watching now was intended to be a live event at Brookings, but unfortunately we got hit by COVID, but we're very happy that we're able to do this as a webinar now. As well as the events, Ben and I are writing extensively, and we hope to turn this into a book on retirement, what we think families should do, what we think policy should do, and what we think business should do in order to improve retirement and retirement security. We have been very fortunate in getting funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Arnold Ventures, and the Smith Richardson Foundation for this work. I'm now going to turn this over to our two speakers. We have Professor David Neumark, who's a distinguished professor of economics at the University of California at Irvine. He's written extensively on a number of related topics, but particularly on discrimination in labor markets and discrimination against older workers. We also have Seth Harris, who was formerly professor of law at New York Law School, where he wrote on labor economics and employment law, and indeed he still does now. He was Deputy Secretary of Labor and then Acting Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration. So we're very lucky to have two very distinguished people today. I'm now going to turn it over to David. He's going to talk for about 10 minutes. He's got a few slides to put up. And then after he speaks, he's going to turn it over to Seth. After that, we'll have a question and answer. I will pose some questions to the speakers. And then after that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much. I turn it over to David.
Thank you. I have my Kellogg mug here. It's not in Ben's honor. It's because my son got his MBA there, but a little free advertising anyways. I'm going to give a brief overview of this essay or proposal, I guess I wrote, about strengthening age discrimination protections to help confront the challenge of population aging. Hopefully my screen is going to change, but hang on a second. There we go. Okay, so I think this comes out of a pretty well-known motivation, which is that the population is aging, and that's happening essentially for two reasons. One is different sizes of different birth cohorts, and the second is people living longer, and those things converge to create some policy challenges. The policy challenge we typically, we probably talk about the most in the context of population aging is Social Security financing. The key factor there, some people don't realize, is not so much when you start claiming your benefits, but how long you pay payroll taxes for. So working longer keeps money flowing into the system and helps with solvency. There's also a more general issue, which we sometimes lose sight of, and this perhaps has more to do with people simply living longer. And that is that we talk about a lot of ways people might have a more secure retirement in terms of financial security, saving earlier, financial literacy, all these things, and those are all good. Can't really criticize any of them, but simply working longer and not dipping into your savings till later has sort of a huge effect relative to all these other things. So thinking about ways people might work longer, given that they're living longer, is probably quite useful. So we have in the US implemented many supply side incentives in terms of Social Security reforms to try to encourage people to work longer. And there's both carrots and sticks involved in that, various tax changes, reductions in benefits if you take your benefits early. Some of these and additional proposals have been covered as part of this series, New Approaches to Retirement Security Project. I'm focusing more on demand side barriers, in particular age discrimination. It's something I've studied for a long time. I'll give you a very brief overview of recent research on that. But the point is that if there are demand side barriers to older workers working longer, it may not matter much what we do on the supply side. As we say, it's kind of hard to push on a string. If employers won't hire older workers in whatever dimensions we're going to talk about, or won't employ older workers, we can try to incentivize them to work longer, but the employment is a two-sided relationship. You have to choose to want to work, and somebody has to choose to hire you or to keep you employed. And it's not only an issue of reducing these, because that's another lever with which to increase the length of people's work lives, but also it could be quite complementary with supply side policies. If we fail to reduce the demand side barriers, and I'll show you why I think they're important, people looking at, let's say, the Social Security Trust Fund might say, gosh, we need even harsher reforms. And those harsher reforms may not matter to the three of us on the screen right now. Older, highly educated people who can, hopefully if we stay healthy, work till old ages and don't really have physical challenges. But for a lot of other people, working longer is a problem. And if we just try to do this all through Social Security reforms, we can leave some people in their early 60s kind of between the rock and the hard place. So I talked about employment of older workers, and generally hiring is actually not the only part of the problem, but a very important part of the problem, and what I'm going to focus on today. And the reason for this is really twofold. One is that you might think of encouraging people to work longer as simply giving them incentives or somehow enabling them to stay in their career job for a longer time. It still is true, despite some popular perceptions, that in the US economy, people do tend to settle into longer term jobs as they get older. But it's also true, and it's going to likely become even more true as people work into older ages, that the so-called glide path to retirement is not a single step. Nearly 50% of retirees, and again, I suspect it will go up, follow what you might call a non-traditional path. They take a bridge job. They move from their full-time career job to some other kind of job, might be part-time, might be less physically demanding, might just be different because maybe making money isn't as important for some people and they can do something that speaks to them more. There's partial retirement kind of phenomena where you might on the same job partially retire. And there's what we call unretirement, which just means reversing retirement. So people, have retired, and then lo and behold, 2 years later, they're working again, and then they retire again. And eventually, of course, people leave the workforce, either they retire or they pass away, but it's a non-traditional path. So there is a lot of hiring. And if we're going to imagine a world with 68 and 70 and 72 and 76-year-olds working in larger numbers, my guess is more and more of those people are going to be working in jobs they've been hired into recently. The second reason hiring is very important, I think, is because there's quite strong evidence and quite credible evidence of discrimination against older workers in hiring. This comes, the best evidence comes from field experiments, and these are the experiments, you may have read about them in the newspaper, where a researcher sends out, basically creates artificial job applicants, people who differ by nothing except age. You send them to employers and you see not who gets a job because it doesn't go that far, but who gets called back for an interview. We call these resume correspondence studies typically. Here's just some evidence from a very recent study I did, very large scale. And what you're seeing here is 3 age ranges, around 30, around 50, and around age 65. That's the yellow, orange, and gray. You're seeing a number of different jobs, some for men and some for women. And what these are the callback rates by age. And you can see, if you look at the left two most graphs for women, clear declines and steady declines with age. Callback rates are lower for middle-aged women than young women and lower for older women than either group. For men, you can see it's a little less regular, but in general, certainly from young to old, the callback rates decline. So this is quite strong evidence, and there's other evidence like it, of discrimination against older workers in hiring. And one interesting finding is that it's worse for older women than for older men. And you say that to women my age or a little older than me, and they kind of look at you in the eye and say, yeah, no kidding, like they all knew that already. So maybe I should have known that already. But on the issue of financial security, it's quite important. Women live longer. Old age poverty is more common among older women for that reason and other reasons. So working longer and the barriers posed by age discrimination may be particularly important for older women. Why else is hiring important? There's a couple other reasons, less fundamental, but I think worth bringing up. The ADEA, the Age Discrimination Employment Act, which is essentially the Civil Rights Act version of older workers legislation, in my view, and based on the research, has been more successful at reducing discrimination in terminations than in hiring. So the challenge of kind of creating a system where where employers don't willy-nilly lay off older workers to get rid of them for one reason or another, we haven't solved it completely, but the ADEA works pretty well there. Doesn't work as well for hiring, and partly as a result, I think there's more scope for policy changes to reduce age discrimination in hiring, especially in light of some recent rulings I'll say a little more about. What do I think we should do? One thing I think, and the paper lays obviously is out in greater detail, I think we should increase damages for age discrimination claims. I have evidence from state level variation that states with larger damages, that is the penalty if you are found guilty of age discrimination, is simply larger. What kind of evidence is there? Well, one type of evidence is that when we raised the full retirement age for Social Security to try to incentivize people to work longer, you actually found a bigger response, both in terms of people working longer and claiming benefits later in states that had larger damages in their state age discrimination laws. And this was concentrated on hiring, speaking to my earlier point. So we changed Social Security to encourage people to work longer. And where the laws essentially did more to reduce the demand side barriers, you had a bigger supply response, exactly the kind of complementarity I was talking about earlier. I also extended the figure you saw a moment ago to look at more states and found that there's less age discrimination in states that have larger damages in age discrimination claims. I think we can, and Seth probably knows more about this than I do, but I'll say what I was going to say. I think we can amend the ADA to make it easier to win age discrimination cases. There have been a couple recent cases. One essentially raised the standard for age. It had to be the determining factor in an employer decision, not a reason, which means you have to disprove other explanations, which is very hard to do. A second case said the ADA doesn't allow what are called disparate impact hiring claims. And disparate impact claims, they're different from the sort of explicit discrimination or intentional discrimination. Disparate impact is an employer has what looks like a neutral policy, but it has an adverse impact on a group. So essentially that decision, Cleaver versus CareFusion, also made it tougher. I'll skip the third one here in the interest of time. We can come back to it. But the way to deal with these is to modify the ADEA, right? Because these are interpretations of the ADA as written by the courts. There has been an act floating around, I believe, since last winter, the Protecting Older Workers Against Discrimination Act, which addresses at least the first of these. More controversial, we could extend affirmative action to older workers. There's reason to believe that discrimination laws never work as well on the hiring side as, let's say, on the termination side or the pay side. And that's because it can be hard to identify a class of affected workers. And the damages for not getting hired can actually be fairly small because you might get hired 6 months later. We know from research that affirmative action has boosted employment among other covered groups, minorities and women. Could happen for older workers as well if we're willing to do it. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time and come to this last one. Just a few questions and concerns. One thing people have worried about is whether age or disability discrimination laws have the unintended consequence of deterring hiring of older workers because it makes it more expensive to get rid of them if you need to, let's say, for business reasons. So it's a legitimate theoretical argument. The evidence, I cite a couple papers here, says this doesn't happen. Is there a cost to stronger discrimination laws? Yes, but there are also benefits. It's not clear to me the benefit cost calculus is any different than for other discrimination laws. And if age discrimination actually deters people from working, as opposed to, let's say, resulting in a group getting a lower wage, the costs in terms of society to simply people leaving the workforce earlier than they would have is potentially very high. Finally, is age discrimination different from race, ethnicity, or sex discrimination? This has been discussed a lot. It is in one obvious sense that, if you're black forever, or if you're Latino, you're Latino forever, but everyone will be older, should we be lucky enough to live that long. And in that sense, maybe it's not unfair in the same way as other types of laws, other types of discrimination. I've never understood how this makes it less unfair, but I have heard people make this argument. I think the other dimension of this, which perhaps we're more focused on now, given current events, and this is probably true, that reducing age discrimination is less relevant for other social problems we're trying to combat, or at least some of us are trying to combat, having to do with inequality. Older workers in general, the older population in general, is not the least well-off group in society, as opposed to some other groups that benefit from stronger discrimination laws. So I will hand it over now to Seth Harris.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks to you, Martin, and to Ben for including me in this project. It's really a privilege. I appreciate your support for my research here. Let me also just give a shout out to my two research assistants, Deanna Krokos and Jonathan Harris. This paper would not have been possible without them, and the friends and colleagues who commented on the paper. It was all very, very valuable. So you're going to hear a lot of similarities in what David just presented and what I'm going to present to you, because our papers overlap and are complementary, and I think we're largely in agreement about solutions. I went in a slightly different direction on some solutions. He went in a slightly different direction on other, but we're generally in agreement about the diagnosis. We start in the same place, which is that we observe a paradox, and that is that there is a retirement savings crisis in America. There are a lot of older workers who don't have enough money to support themselves in their retirement, and yet they're not engaged in the principal activity that would allow them to earn more, continue supporting themselves for a long period of time, and then to save more for retirement, and that is productive work into their later years. A simpler way to say that is older workers have a lower employment rate. They have a lower labor force participation rate than prime age and younger workers. The question is why? And I think both David and I are arguing that age discrimination and failed laws and processes for remedying age discrimination play a really important part in that paradox. I think older workers, frankly, are making a rational choice to leave employment and the labor market because they face actual age discrimination. And older workers, I think, are less willing to supply their labor because they perceive age discrimination and understand that they'll get a lesser return for their labor than they would if they were younger or if labor markets didn't have age discrimination. So as a result of that, perceived discrimination and actual discrimination together sort of conspire to force down supply and demand for older workers. And as a result, older workers' employment rates and labor force participation are lower. I'm going to propose 4 solutions, but first let me give a very quick review of the diagnosis. As David suggested, if you compare the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, which protects against age discrimination for workers age 40 or older, and you compare that to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which protects against race, sex, religious discrimination, other kinds of discrimination, we find that the protections for older workers are weaker. In the case of disparate treatment cases, which are generally thought of as intentional discrimination cases, age discrimination plaintiffs have a more difficult standard to satisfy when proving that their age caused the employer's decision. As David pointed out, it's but for causation rather than showing only that age discrimination was a motivating factor. Let me say that's the Supreme Court's fault. For disparate impact cases, which, as David said, involve facially neutral practices that fall disproportionately on a group because of their age or their race or their sex, in those cases, employer defendants have a much easier defense they can use to defeat a worker's claim, and that one is Congress's fault. And let me say, both David and I point out in our paper that disparate impact claims are not available under the ADEA to job applicants as opposed to job holders. That's also the lower court's fault. For reasonable accommodation cases under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the issue is not that older workers have weaker protections. Rather, it's that older workers with disabilities are supposed to receive reasonable accommodations if they're needed, but we don't really know what's happening in the interactive process. That's the term of art in the ADA, the interactive process between worker and employer that's supposed to produce that accommodation. We don't know if it's being done sincerely. We don't know if it's being done effectively. We honestly don't even know if it's being done at all. And that's especially important because a majority of the civilian non-institutional population that's age 55 or older, older workers, have some kind of a disability. And workers with disabilities over the age of 55 have a 13% labor force participation rate. That brings down the overall labor force participation rate for older workers. And there are two factors that exacerbate those legal weaknesses. First, an estimated 60 million workers have been compelled by contracts imposed on them by their employers to arbitrate any discrimination claims against their employer rather than taking those claims to the EEOC or to court. There is persuasive evidence that arbitration provisions produce worse outcomes and worse processes for workers and better outcomes for employers. So it's essentially a privatized adjudication system that is skewed against workers, including older workers. The second factor is that the union density rate in the US is only 10.3%. So the overwhelming majority of older workers don't benefit from the anti-discrimination protections that are found in collective bargaining agreements or that they would get from union representation. There are 4 collective bargaining agreement provisions that guard against age discrimination. First, provisions requiring the employer to show just cause before disciplining or discharging a worker. Second, anti-discrimination provisions that may be stronger than the ADEA or the ADA. There are seniority provisions that protect longer tenured workers who tend to be older. And finally, there's a multi-step grievance procedure for administering claims related to those substantive CBA provisions. And when you have a union involved, the maladies of the individual arbitration system disappear. They're all solved, and I detail that in the paper. So the lack of a union in the workplace exposes older workers to the weaknesses in our public law anti-discrimination system. So let's talk about discrimination. Let me just say, when you're sharing a webinar with the leading scholar who's built the evidence that shows that there is discrimination, I'm not going to really bother to spend a lot of time on the actual discrimination side. David and I both detail it. David detailed some of it in his presentation, I thought extremely well, capturing what we know, some of what we know. I'd like to spend my limited time focusing on the negative labor supply effects of older workers' perceptions of discrimination against them. That's an issue we don't talk enough about, in my humble opinion, so let's focus on it a little bit. I cited several surveys in my paper that demonstrate pretty powerfully that older workers perceive that they are disadvantaged by discrimination. Just a few relevant data points. 61% of workers age 45 or older report that they have themselves experienced or they have witnessed discrimination at work. 1 in 5 older workers feared losing her job, and 1/3 of that group feared they would lose their job because of age discrimination. Almost 10% of retired men and 7.5% of retired women aged 50 and older reported that they had retired because of age discrimination. And there are many, many more results like those. Those perceptions, accurate or not, suppress older workers' labor supply, and older workers' higher labor supply elasticity, meaning their sensitivity to discrimination-driven outcomes like lower wages and higher job search costs, amplifies discrimination's effects and causes older workers to leave jobs and to leave the labor market. And I give that calculus in greater detail in my paper. So what are the solutions? I propose 4. Like David, I propose amending the ADEA so that disparate treatment and disparate impact claims are handled in the same way they're handled under Title VII. And like David, I would like to see job applicants able to bring disparate impact claims. As David said, there is bipartisan legislation that has already passed the House. All we need is for the Senate and the President to act. Second, we should end mandatory arbitration of ADEA and ADA claims. The FAIR Act, which would accomplish this result and do a lot more, has already passed the House as well. So we need Senate action and we need action by the President. Third, we should require employers to disclose the number and results of their interactive processes with older workers with disabilities. And that should be anonymized, of course. And at the same time, we really need to deepen research into the interactive process and ADA litigation results. That solution can be implemented by Congress by amending the ADA to require reporting to the EEOC, Or the Labor Department's Office of Federal Contract Compliance programs could promulgate a disclosure requirement, but that requirement would only apply to federal contractors, not to all employers. I'd like to see it apply to all employers. Also, let me say I'd like to see my former colleagues in the Labor Department and the Office of Disability Employment Policy study the effectiveness and the fairness of the interactive process a lot more extensively. There's a lot we don't know, and we need to know more because of the prevalence of disability among older workers. Finally, we need to substantially increase the number of older workers represented by unions. Now, that's easy to say, hard to do. It will not happen overnight, but we need to get started. The House has passed the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, which would contribute meaningfully to increasing union density. Again, the Senate and the President will need to act. Let me just say one closing word. Whenever you talk about discrimination, I think it's worth giving this caveat and suggesting, when you throw out a bunch of proposals, as David and I have, it's easy to sound glib and to suggest that, well, if you just do what I say, we're going to solve the whole problem. The truth is, discrimination is stubborn and it's deeply ingrained. And I don't think my proposals are going to completely eliminate discrimination against older workers, but I think they will reduce discrimination, they will manage discrimination, they will make it less of a barrier to the employment of older workers and to their labor force participation. So for those reasons, I really think they're well worth pursuing. So Martin, with that, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, both of you. I thought that was terrific. I really enjoyed your papers and your presentation. I should have mentioned earlier that these papers will be available on the Brookings website. They are not available now. We are going to have another part to this webinar, and all the papers will go out together probably sometime in early November. Now, let me just throw a couple of questions. Let me start with you, David. You've done a lot of great work on really estimating some of the effects or showing the effects of discrimination. But, part of my job here is to press you a little bit. So I'm going to sort of press you on that evidence. You show that really one of the main pieces of evidence you presented is that if you put in applications without regard to age, you find that older workers don't get as many sort of callback calls or callback letters. Although even there, you only find it strongly in the case of women, less strongly in the case of men. So is that strong enough? Is what you see is the strongest evidence? Is there other evidence? What about workers already in jobs, or how is the evidence there in terms of whether or not they're discriminated against? And when you're doing those, sending in the resumes, it's quite hard, isn't it, to have someone that the only difference is that their age is different. So how do you sort of overcome that problem when you're doing this research?
Those are good questions. Thank you. So two separate questions, I think. One is, how strong is this evidence? Could it be better? What about other dimensions of labor market behavior, like terminations? And the second is kind of some of these details about how you do this. So let me answer the second question first, because it goes to the strength of the evidence. One of the reasons we wrote that paper was because it is actually a little tricky to use this resume correspondence study method with respect to older workers, right? If I want to do blacks and whites or men and women, and they're the same age, it's really not at all odd to have the resumes look identical, except maybe a male name, female name, or a black sounding name, a non-black sounding name, Latino name, even easier than a black sounding name, whatever it might be. When you get to older workers, it's a little trickier because you can't really make them look identical without worrying a little bit what's going on, right? You can't give a young worker 40 years of experience because they might only be 30 years old. And if you give the older worker only 10 years of experience to make them look like a 30-year-old, that resume may look a little odd. So we did a lot of variants of resumes, long experience older workers, shorter experience older workers, partly to try to figure out whether it mattered and partly to try to figure out whether the early evidence was biased because it tended to use the kind of short resume to the older worker approach. And it turns out it doesn't matter. The evidence is actually very robust. So we think we took that issue off the table. The other issue you worry about a lot is, and this is something economists worry about more than lawyers, right? Economists talk about taste discrimination, like discrimination driven by an aversion to, interacting with, or in this case, employing a group, versus statistical discrimination, which is making, not hiring them in this case, let's say, because of assumptions about the group as a whole, even if these assumptions are true. So you might assume that an older worker isn't going to stay with the employer as long as a younger worker. That's often overstated because while older workers leave to retirement, younger workers leave to other jobs, which is, from the point of view of the current employer, is no different. But legally, it doesn't matter. Those are both illegal, but employers worry about that a lot. And we certainly got pushed on what do we think is going on. So we did a lot to kind of deal with that. We would give some older workers more computer skills so employers wouldn't make assumptions about maybe they were a little more technologically obsolete, one of the common stereotypes about older workers. We did things to try to signal that they didn't have declining health, maybe because of the kind of job they were in. And to all those things, the results were pretty robust. So I think in that sense, we're pretty convinced by the study. Hopefully other people are. And it does comport with a lot of other evidence, which is always a good test, I suppose. To the other question, is this the best or only kind of evidence of discrimination? This is an interesting question. So this is where economists and sociologists, even when we work on the same thing, discrimination, kind of are at loggerheads because the sociologists see a difference and say, isn't the most likely thing in the world it's discrimination, and maybe you want to show me evidence to the contrary. And the economists say, isn't the most likely thing that it's not discrimination because that doesn't make any sense for employers. So you got to work really hard to prove that it is. So that goes to what that means is that we have a lot of observational evidence on differences in outcomes. One of the most common facts you see, for example, is that unemployment durations of older workers are longer than unemployment durations of younger workers. Now, obviously, if there's discrimination in hiring, that would generate that. But there's also you could tell lots of other stories about that, why that might happen, right? A 40-year-old might take any job they get because they need it, and a 20-year-old even more. A 65-year-old, maybe with some money in the bank, might be only take a job that really appeals to them on a lot of dimensions or gets them the schedule they want or whatever it might be. So they might be pickier, they might have what we call a higher reservation wage. So there's a lot of observational evidence, and it all points in the same direction, so that's good and reassuring and tells me we're largely getting it right. But the experimental evidence where I manipulate the resumes, so nothing in my experiment can be driven by workers making different decisions about, let's say, accepting a job. Why? Well, first of all, they're not real people. They're just artificial electronic virtual applicants. That's the fundamental reason. I would say, though, that one thing I think is an important research challenge, and I don't have any great ideas yet, except to say that it's an important research challenge, is how can we bring this more rigorous kind of experimental evidence to bear on other decisions? So in hiring, we figured out a way to do an experiment. But suppose I wanted to study promotion decisions or selections for training or selections for layoffs. That's something that goes on inside the firm. We're not going to be able to do the kind of thing I do in this hiring study, but is it conceivable perhaps that a firm that maybe thinks there might be discrimination, would like to avoid it, would like to learn how much they're doing it, would be willing to run an internal experiment? You're making some selection for training decisions, make them anonymous. Couldn't work in a small company because you sort of know who everyone is, but maybe in a large company it could. Or maybe you bring in people to make the decisions who don't know them. So I think that's if I were to think about sort of the most productive, although difficult frontier for this kind of work, it's going to be figure out a way to bring experimental methods to these other methods, other kind of employment decisions, and see if we can get as rigorous evidence.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Seth, let me turn to you. So you've been in the political environment. You were in the Obama administration. We've seen now over the last 4 years really quite a big change in that political environment. Now we're coming up to election, so maybe that will change back, or maybe it will stay the same. We've yet to find that out. Excuse me. But just sort of step back from some of these proposals that you're describing. How do they fit within the current sort of political climate? We now have a different Supreme Court than we had before. We even have a different set of judges that are in place than we had before. quite a few business people, one of the reasons that they were kind of disgruntled in the Obama administration, they said there's just too much regulation. We're always having to follow all these rules, and it's taking a lot of time. Small employers don't like doing it. So talk about your proposals and really sort of increasing what might be seen as the burden of regulation in this new environment, recognizing that obviously we don't know how, as we're talking together, we don't know how the election is going to turn out. But nevertheless, it's a different world than it was 4 years ago. It's a different world than it has been in the past sometimes. And does it make sense to try to impose a lot of new regulatory requirements on businesses?
Well, so I promise I will answer that, but I want to just spend one minute on the evidence question that that you asked David about, if you don't mind. Employment discrimination law is largely constructed around how much and what kinds of circumstantial evidence are sufficient to prove discrimination, or at least to create a presumption of discrimination that the employer then has to rebut. It's very rare. When I was teaching employment discrimination in law school, I used to say to my students, it's very rare that you find the smoking gun memo where it says, let's not hire Seth, he's way too old. Occasionally you find employers that are that stupid, but most employers are simply too decent to do something like that, but also are sufficiently well counseled by their attorneys to not use language like that in any formal, lasting way. So as a general matter, employment discrimination law is predicated on circumstantial evidence proving the presence of discrimination rather than direct evidence. So in addition to the evidence that David was talking about, there is a substantial body of evidence that stereotypes, derogatory stereotypes about older workers, some of which David identified, but there are many, many, many more, persist among people who are involved in employer decision-making about hiring, about promotion, about training, about job assignment, about transfer, about all those kinds of things. So in a circumstance where you have evidence of derogatory stereotyped attitudes and you have bad outcomes for older workers, at a minimum, the burden should shift to the employer to demonstrate that all of those attitudes are not what drove the bad outcomes, that it was something else, as David was saying, it was some other exogenous factor unrelated to age. And the reforms that both he and I are proposing would produce that kind of an effect. They have the effect of saying, well, if we believe from circumstantial evidence and other sources that there is discrimination in the process, well, then the employer has to come forward and show us that it is not. That's the centerpiece of employment discrimination law, not just with respect to age, but also with respect to race and sex, that I think is really critical here. So I don't want to establish an evidentiary burden that is beyond what you'd even have to do in court when we're talking about the creation of public policy. So now let me, with that long preface, let me answer the question you actually asked me. Certainly the political environment is deeply polarized, and there is a very good reason why no meaningful progress was made on anti-discrimination measures during the Trump administration. That's even a change within the Republican Party. You have to remember that it was George H.W. Bush who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there are people in the Republican Party who are not allergic to anti-discrimination measures, even if they impose burdens on employers. But I'm, as a general matter, unmoved by the argument that we don't want to burden businesses because that's going to create an unnecessary drag on the economy, on their opportunities to make profit. Remember what we're saying here. We're simply saying to employers, do not allow, and to the extent possible, prevent and protect against discrimination that's unrelated to productivity-based, merit-based decision-making in your workforce. If that is, there's a long time belief, I think among economists, certainly among lawyers, that discrimination is a barrier to economic success, a barrier to productivity, rather than a burden on employers. To some extent, employers are making, or people who work for employers, it's usually not a formal decision of the employer. People who work for employers are making decisions that are destructive for the employer as well as for other workers. That's true in sexual harassment cases. It's true certainly in race discrimination cases. And I believe it's true also in age discrimination cases. So to some extent, what you're saying is let's take an anti-productivity, inefficient barrier out of the workforce. That will be good for everyone involved. Now, is there cost? Of course, there is definitely going to be some positive cost. For smaller employers, the cost will be very light. For larger employers, it's going to be more complicated because their hiring and promotion and transfer and training decisions are much more diffuse. There are many, many more people involved. It's harder to prevent and guard against age discrimination. Let me just make one point about, you mentioned judges. There is zero question that the flood of conservative judges onto the courts, and these are not traditional conservative legal thinkers. These are really, many of them are rather quite fringe legal thinkers. I think that is going to create a problem in the adjudication of these cases, because what those judges try to do is to read these statutes narrowly in order to avoid providing protections to workers. That's the typical pattern. And that puts a burden on Congress to be very clear about what these statutes mandate and how they seek to achieve their desired goal. Because the more ambiguity they allow, the more opportunity there is for judges who have their own ideological agenda to limit the remedial effects of the laws.
Thank you. So you think it's really going to be Congress that's going to have to change things and make it clear what they're looking for. It's no good leaving it up to judges now, or at least not in the same way that we may have in the past.
Yes, well, so I would say that the judges have been a part of the problem here. You know, one of the problems David and I both identified, the unavailability of disparate impact claims to job applicants, that is a judicial creation. That's not something Congress did. Congress did create the weaker defense for disparate impact claims for employers, but Congress was not responsible. Well, the court might disagree with this, court watchers might disagree with this, but the court chose to read the 1991 Civil Rights Act in order to make it harder for older workers to bring disparate treatment claims. They didn't have to read it that way. I talk about this a little bit in my paper. So judges have been a problem for a while, but now I think we're going to see that kind of influence on steroids with these more ideological, more conservative judges.
Your point, I think, is that there's no reason the law couldn't be amended to say disparate impact claims are allowed. That can be in the law.
Precisely.
Well, again, in the spirit of being a little argumentative and sort of pushing back against you guys, we are in the middle of a COVID crisis. We have a huge decline in employment. A lot of the people that are out of jobs are minorities, women. So that we are going to have to go a long way to get back to something like full employment, or try to restore the fortunes of those groups. In that environment, and I'll pose it first to David and then ask Seth to chime in. In that environment, does it make sense to add to regulatory burdens? Do you think this should be the first thing that the president does, whoever's the next president? Do you think this is a key thing to do, or is it something that maybe would be later on once we restored something like full employment?
I don't think it's the first thing the president should do. I think we've had the creation of quite a backlog of things that need doing, and there are definitely some higher priorities. But in relation to the sort of the more general question of how this relates to the pandemic and the recovery and all that, I'm actually not as pessimistic about the recovery as some people are, because I think,
hope you're right.
The financial sector, and as best I can tell, we don't really have a problem with, for many households, of purchasing power having declined. We don't. So I kind of think the service sector will bounce back as soon as we can all go use it. But of course, that hasn't happened yet. I could be wrong. I do think there's a particular problem in relation to older workers, in that, while mortality rates seem to be declining everywhere, older people are at greater risk. And that may create, especially if the liability is unclear, I'm sure Seth knows more about this than I do, you know, to come to work and contract COVID in the workplace, what happens? It seems for a number of reasons, either just because you think an older worker might get sick or because you think you might be on the hook for it. There might be greater barriers to hiring older workers. And how we're going to handle that in terms of age discrimination or disability discrimination, I'm not really sure. In a sense, you can think about it as discrimination based on future disability. And one of the things I didn't get to was how I thought the ADA and the ADEA should be a bit more integrated, because, you know, if you're hiring a 70-year-old who doesn't have a disability now, they're much more likely to develop one and impose a cost on you for a reasonable accommodation than a 30-year-old is, obviously. And this may just exacerbate that kind of problem. So, you know, if you want to say, gee, should we worry first about the minorities getting their jobs back and then the older people? I don't know that we have to really draw those, draw those priorities. But I do think that the recovery may face a particular barrier or generate a particular barrier to older worker reemployment because of the health issues.
Do you want to chime in, Seth, and talk a little bit about, you know, given that we're in this pandemic, which is not where we expected to be at this time?
Well, so I think I'm inclined to agree with David with respect to the point that he made, but also I am paint me a skeptic about this argument that pervades our public policy discourse that regulations are job killers and that they are barriers to employment. There's a good bit of evidence that the initial cost benefit analyses that agencies undertake when as they're required to do by executive order of the regulations that they propose, there's a good bit of evidence that those cost benefit analyses almost always, or certainly very frequently, grossly overstate the costs of regulations. And the reason for that is that the regulated community adapts. You know, the cost benefit analysis is static, but the world is not static. Unless you're really quite bad at your job, no one who's regulated doesn't say, okay, now I have to integrate this into my management systems and make decisions that will allow me to do this in the least effective way and maybe in a way that actually maximizes my profits, which after all is their job. So I'm not persuaded that as I said before, I'm not persuaded that anti-discrimination measures result in fewer people being employed, particular kinds of folks not being employed. I think there is a special challenge for older workers in the COVID environment because they are a risk group, as are workers with disabilities, old or not, and anyone with an underlying condition is in a risk group. But I'm not sure that creating more protections for them means that we're going to snuff out otherwise productive decisions rather than unproductive decisions by employers. So I'm just not a fan of that what I think of as a trope that really is not got a lot of evidentiary support behind it. I've experienced this as a regulator myself. We are very careful to make sure that benefits exceed costs, even without this discount that we should be applying, that costs are almost always overstated. And in those kinds of circumstances, I frankly think that what we're more often talking about is cost shifting, right? Is employers suffer costs, but workers benefit from a transfer to them. You know, occupational safety and health regulation being an excellent example of this. If you keep workers from being killed, being made sick, being injured in the workplace, then their families don't suffer the costs of those economic losses, even if the employer does have to spend a little bit more for a machine guard, or in the case of COVID, for PPE, or for a hand washing station, or for paid leave for workers. So if we're going to shift resources, I'm comfortable shifting it from folks in the corporate world to workers in a circumstance where what we have is insufficient demand in the economy. The demanders, the consumers, are the people who need those resources.
Martin, can I just add one more thing to that? I think another reason that more specific to this case about the benefits versus costs of regulations is if some of the negative stereotypes about older workers are wrong, right, they can change. right? And there could be, you know, that could wipe out any costs and generate benefits. Now, do we know that's true? Not so clear. I mean, we know that negative stereotypes have declined somewhat. You know, why did that happen? Well, it may have happened because employers are employing more older workers, right? Because we've had increases in employment rates in the last 12 years or so. But they've also gotten healthier, right? So that may have been part of it as well. But to the extent that experience with workers overcomes negative stereotypes, you know, there can be net gains easily from this.
Right.
Well, if I can cross to your side of the street for a second, I mean, if we know that older workers have a tough time getting new jobs, much more so maybe than younger workers do, I think older workers have really been particularly hard hit, and the unemployment rates for older workers, I think, do reflect that. So that might be an argument that you do want to, as you move into the recovery, you do want to pay particular attention to the situation of older workers. So let me just ask each of you, and I'll go back to you, David, first. If there are just any sort of additional comments, reflections on things that Seth said, or anything that you'd just like to add. We sort of pretty much used up our time, but if you have a last remark or two, I'd love to hear it.
I think the only remark I'd make is, you know, departing from some of the details of what we've been talking about, is just for people to reflect a bit on age discrimination. It's an odd form of discrimination in the sense that, you know, I think most other forms of discrimination have really become taboo and something you never admit to, and you don't tell jokes about, and you certainly don't in polite company say something adverse about a particular group. But for whatever reason, I don't know the reason, I'm not a social psychologist or whoever studies this, you know, age stereotyping is okay, age jokes are okay, and I'm not going to say I'm innocent either. And I think the puzzle of why that's the case is interesting, and may also be one of the things we really need to address to solve this problem.
Well, I'm an older worker myself, and I suspect neither of you is all that young, so I think we all have a vested interest in getting rid of the old folk jokes, right?
I have 10 years.
Seth, any last comments?
So I just want to lift up a part of David's paper, and to a lesser extent my own paper, about the important role of intersectionality in these issues. David, I think, really did us a great service by pointing out that older women face much greater discrimination than older men. I think that women would say, yeah, it doesn't change when we get older, it maybe just gets magnified. It's true throughout the course of our lives. I tried to highlight the intersectionality of age and disability, which maybe is a more obvious connection, because as you get older, you're more likely to suffer some kind of a physical or mental disability. That actually creates fairly complicated legal problems, and David highlighted those, but he teased us and said we should solve this problem, but he didn't give us the complete answer, and I'm looking forward to his next paper where he gives us the complete answer to that problem. My hope is that by aligning sex discrimination law with age discrimination law, that will help with intersectionality claims. It certainly should help with the litigation of those claims. And in the case of the ADA, we're supposed to have this cooperative process. And my hope is that if we get more visibility into that process, then we can address the intersectionality of older workers and disability.
I must say, I think this has been a really terrific discussion, and I appreciate your presentations, your responses to my slightly argumentative questions, and for joining us in this webinar. So thank you both very much. It's really terrific.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Welcome to our event today on working longer and strategies to encourage Americans to spend more time in the labor market. This event is part of a 2-year series that's a joint collaboration between the Kellogg School of Management and the Brookings Institution, led by Senior Fellow at Brookings, Martin Baily, and myself, a professor at Kellogg. We have had a series of events over the past 2 years aimed at improving the well-being of older Americans. We've had an event on reverse mortgages. We've had an event on annuities. We had a prior event on working longer. And this event today is the final event in our series focused on working longer. We have a truly terrific panel today. We're very excited. We're joined by Susan Houseman. Susan is a labor economist who serves as Vice President and Director of Research at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. She chairs the consensus study on contingent and alternative work arrangement. She chairs the technical advisory committee to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and she co-directs the labor statistics program at the Institute of Labor Economics. We also have Beth Truesdale with us today. Beth is a sociologist who studies economic inequality, labor markets, and health. She is a research associate at Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies and is a co-editor of the volume Overtime, America's Aging Workforce and the Failure and the Future of Working Longer. So thank you so much. So really quickly, our event today will feature a presentation by both Susan and Beth, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll wrap up. So with that, I'm incredibly excited to turn it over to Susan Houseman. Susan.
Great, thank you. Good, well, this work, let me note first, is joint with Catherine Abraham at the University of Maryland, and we're focused on improving workforce services for older Americans. By way of background, people are living longer and they're healthier at older ages, and many need or want to work beyond the traditional age of retirement. Many work surveys show to stay connected at later ages, but a majority lack adequate savings for retirement. And so they need, for financial reasons, to continue to work. At the same time that people are wanting to work longer or needing to work longer, the US economy is becoming increasingly reliant on older workers. This, to a large degree, reflects the aging of the baby boomer generation. Today, nearly a quarter of the labor force is aged 55 or older. That's up 12 percentage points just in the last 25 years. The policy challenge is that older workers often must change jobs late in life. This could be due to job loss. It also could be due to the need to leave a job. For example, think of manual workers. They may no longer, as they age, be physically able to perform their job. In both of these circumstances, people at older ages will need to search for new employment, and they may need to switch industries or even occupations. Many are concerned that the rapid pace of technical change and globalization may increase the future work rate of dislocation. And we know that older workers who lose their jobs find it most difficult to secure new employment. There are various factors for this challenge that they face. One of them is that discrimination is widespread against older workers in employment, and many may become discouraged and just stop looking for work. Also, frequently, workers who need or to change jobs haven't looked for a job recently, and so they lack the experience. They may simply not know how to go about it. And finally, and very importantly, their skills may be outdated, so they're less attractive to employers. Last year, in a record low unemployment economy, nevertheless, 1 million Americans aged 55 and older were unemployed. Another 1.5 million who weren't counted as unemployed nonetheless said that they wanted a job. The permanent job losses that we've experienced during the current recession have only worsened the problem. Okay, sorry about that. The federal state workforce system is the main policy vehicle for helping the unemployed find new jobs, but we're going to argue that this does not meet the needs of older workers. Just quickly by way of background, the Workforce Opportunity and Investment Act, known as WIOA, primarily funds these reemployment and training services. Programs operate through American job centers located across the country in many, many communities. WIOA authorizes separate programs for youth, disadvantaged adults, and dislocated workers, but not for older workers. And as just noted, in addition to facing the special challenges of finding new work, many older workers are less comfortable with the automated systems used today in job centers, and they may feel uncomfortable in job centers where many of the clients and staff are much younger. So we recommend, first and foremost, and most fundamentally, that workforce programs be tailored to meet the special needs of older Americans. At a minimum, job centers should have specialized staff who understand older workers' needs and can more effectively serve them. They also should experiment with job placement programs specifically tailored for older workers. An example is AARP's so-called Experience for Hire program, which is currently being piloted in Michigan. In this program, job centers arrange job fairs at which older workers interview with employers who are interested in hiring them. They've been pre-matched to those employers. They know that they potentially would have a job. This program is intended, among other things, to address seniors' concerns about discrimination in the job market and their aversion to job centers. We also believe that workforce programs should promote self-employment. Self-employment rises dramatically with age, and this partly reflects older workers' desire for flexibility. Job centers primarily focus on placing workers into traditional wage and salary jobs, but they should also make particularly older workers aware of various self-employment and independent contractor options. This could include platform work. We understand that platform work is controversial, or certain types are, but certain platforms may be especially suitable for older workers. Platforms perform, for example, certain functions such as mediating payments, and so it may make it easier for workers to establish themselves as independent contractors. That can be difficult, at older ages. And certain platforms, when people are working online, are especially attractive to populations with disabilities or mobility issues that are prevalent amongst older workers. Workforce programs should provide targeted skills development for older workers. Long and expensive training programs are generally not optimal for them, but targeted programs can provide them with critical skills for finding good jobs in our changing economy. Remember, one of the big problems they face is outdated skills. This could involve, for example, providing some digital literacy. Research, for example, has found that short e-learning programs can teach many older adults with no prior computer skills how to use programs like Excel. The only existing program that specifically targets older workers, and it's actually been around for many decades, is the Senior Community Services Employment Program. It provides services for low-income seniors who have failed in WIOA programs or have special needs. It places them into supported work with the idea that that will facilitate transitions to unsubsidized employment. But the funding and the number of served has been dramatically reduced in recent years, and it reaches just a small share of those in need. Or finally, we recommend that we evaluate new programs and initiatives. Too often, we don't spend modest resources to evaluate programs. It's important to know what new programs and initiatives are working and what are improving service delivery. In closing, I just want to point out that implementing our proposals would require relatively modest new expenditures. We're not proposing expensive new programs. We think that be made by working within the existing system. So with that, let me turn it over to Beth.
There we go. Thanks so much. I'm just thrilled to be here. So we're here to talk about working longer. And a big part of the reason that we're talking about working longer at all is because retirement security has become so terribly fragile for most Americans over the past 4 decades. Private workplace pensions have declined. Social security benefits have been reduced as the retirement age rises. And so most Americans approaching traditional retirement ages won't have enough income to maintain their standard of living. And many policymakers have embraced the idea that working longer in the sense of remaining in paid work beyond traditional retirement ages is the really key solution. And when we talk about working longer, we often start with this question: how can older Americans be encouraged to delay retirement? And I want to talk about one of the big problems that turns up when we equate working longer with choosing to delay retirement. And the problem is that the idea of delaying retirement just doesn't make much sense if you don't have a job to delay retiring from. As Susan was saying, in the past couple of years, fewer than 3% of Americans in their late 50s were unemployed, but more than a quarter were already out of the labor force. And most Americans who are out of the labor force in their mid-50s are not going to be candidates for working beyond traditional retirement ages. Here we also run into the inequalities that are so deeply embedded in American life, because those who have jobs to delay retiring from are disproportionately people with higher levels of education and greater access to good jobs. Let me show you a graph of these inequalities here. So as you can see, inequalities in employment are really large all the way across the life course. When we zoom in on those who are coming up on retirement age, among, say, 55-year-old men, about 90% of college graduates are employed compared to about 65% of those without a high school diploma. Among women, the proportion who are employed is lower, but the inequalities are, if anything, even bigger. And when we look at the scale of labor force non-participation and unemployment among Americans in their 50s, especially those with lower levels of education, I want to argue that we really need to rethink what ages we have in mind when we're talking about extending working lives. In the American policy conversation about working longer, we're often focused on talking about how we extend work into the late 60s, even into the early 70s. But the issues with working longer begin so much younger for many, many workers. And you can see here that the employment rates drop about 20 percentage points between ages 50 and 60 in all these educational groups. So my argument is that we need to pay a lot more attention to what's happening to workers well before we get to traditional retirement ages. Now, that situation, especially for low-wage workers, is already pretty bad, and it's getting worse. Working longer was in jeopardy for an increasing number of Americans even before the pandemic. While the working longer conversation emphasizes that employment rates have risen consistently among adults over the age of 55, prime age labor force participation has fallen among men and women in more recent cohorts. And there's agreement that this is driven mostly by increasingly precarious employment in low-wage work. And trends in prime age employment are really important for the working longer conversation because as today's younger cohorts age, fewer people approach retirement with a really solid history of employment across the life course. So I'd argue that the policy goal of increasing labor force participation among older Americans is fundamentally in tension with a precarious low-wage economy. The crucial insight here is that better jobs for prime age workers are essential for longer working lives. And this is especially true if our vision of working longer is not just of having any job, but of employment at older age that's financially, emotionally, and socially rewarding. Jobs that are precarious, that have low wages, high turnover rates, and few benefits don't provide a solid foundation for working longer. So what this lets us do is it opens up the working longer conversation to a much wider range of policy solutions than we typically discuss when we talk about the labor market for older workers. Policies that improve job quality and help to decrease job turnover among low-wage workers in their 40s and 50s could be policies that help those low-wage workers stay steadily employed for more years as they age. So today I want to offer just 3 specific policy proposals: an improved minimum wage, so-called fair workweek laws, and a universal paid family and medical leave benefit. Now, these policies have been really widely discussed among people who are trying to improve the well-being of lower income workers, usually in the context of talking about prime age labor force participation. But these kinds of policies have been mostly missing from the working longer discussion. These policies have also showed a lot of promise at the state and local level, and so I think they're really ripe for broader state and federal action. So first, a higher minimum wage. For workers toward the bottom of the labor market, the minimum wage is an important determinant of pay. It's extremely low. It's $7.25 an hour. And that sum has eroded in real terms from a peak in 1968. It's now the lowest in the affluent world in terms of buying power. Over the short term, a reasonable wage floor reduces poverty and increases consumer demand. Over the longer term, higher minimum wages reduce employee turnover. And important for talking about retirement security, raising the minimum wage increases people's eventual Social Security retirement benefits. So I'd argue for a $15 federal minimum wage that keeps pace with inflation and covers both tipped and untipped workers. A $15 minimum wage that's phased in over several years is actually modest in the extreme, although it's much, much better than the current minimum. So that's first. Second are so-called fair workweek laws. Many low-wage jobs, especially retail, hospitality, food service, have short, variable, and unpredictable hours. For example, they have schedules that are posted just a few days ahead of time or require the employee to be on call whether they end up being needed to work or not. Unsurprisingly, precarious schedules are bad for workers' finances, their families, and their health. They lead to job loss and high turnover because they make it really hard for workers to meet their own needs and those of their families. So I suggest that we need fair workweek laws along the lines of those that have been passed in several states and cities during the past few years. These policies typically require 2 weeks of advance notice for schedules. They reduce or eliminate on-call and split shifts, and they enable part-time workers to access more hours. These policies should help to improve the quality and stability of low-wage work for workers of all ages. And third, universal paid medical and family leave. This is really important because workers who face their own illness or who are caring for relatives often find that they can have a job where they can take care of their personal and family lives, but they can't do both. Family issues pose a lot of challenges for labor force participation among older workers. As American society ages, a lot more middle-aged workers have elderly parents who need care, and caregiving for parents often results in workers, especially women, leaving employment in their 50s. Health issues in these years also increase the risk of labor force exit. So I'd argue for universal paid family and medical leave insurance. There's good momentum on these policies. By the end of 2019, 8 states had enacted paid leave laws. All of these allow for paid leave for a variety of reasons: for care for a new child, care for a family member with a serious health condition, and care for one's own health. Paid leave should help workers of all ages stay attached to paid work. Finally, a word about the cost of these proposals. Opponents of increases in the minimum wage often argue that high minimum wages will decrease labor demand. But increasingly, research on the topic suggests that the employment effects of higher wages are small to nil, and if they reduce turnover, they may even be positive. For fair workweek laws, there's experimental evidence from retail that schedule stability pretty markedly improves business performance. And universal paid medical and family leave can be funded, as most states have done, as a social insurance program rather than as an employer mandate. So cost should not be a barrier to these proposals. So that's where I conclude with the argument that good jobs pave the way for working longer. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Susan, for those very interesting presentations and really taking a different approach to the same problem, which I think is just terrific and makes for an interesting discussion. So let's spend a few minutes now, and I'll ask you a few questions, and we can go in depth a little bit more. let me start by asking about the pandemic and how this has changed your views on older workers and the policies needed to help them stay in the labor market. So maybe Beth, I'll just start with you and then we'll go to Susan. Beth, how has, or maybe how hasn't the pandemic changed your view on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the pandemic has obviously made everything worse when we're talking about health and employment and at older ages. So the idea that we should encourage older workers to delay retirement also hinges on this idea that older workers choose when to retire. And of course, for many, that's just not the case. In recent years, but even before the pandemic, more than half of retirees were saying that they were forced or partly forced to retire. As Susan was saying, age discrimination is a real problem, and it means that job loss often leads to involuntary early retirement. And then you bring on the pandemic. And so you add these health risks of in-person working, which are, especially common in low and middle wage work, and most serious for older workers. And you couple that with decreased job prospects across the board. And the result is that we're seeing millions of older workers leaving the labor force, and not just leaving the labor force, but also saying that they are retired, which suggests that a lot of those folks are not going to come back to the labor force. And if previous recessions are any guide, a lot of workers who are in their 50s now are really going to struggle to find new jobs. Older workers tend to be the last to get rehired. And so the bottom line for me is really that with the pandemic, this idea of choosing to delay retirement, which was already a non-starter for a lot of Americans, is going to be a non-starter for a lot more. And I think, we're going to have to, if we're going to try to patch the holes in retirement security, that is to try to prevent millions of older Americans from being pushed into poverty in retirement, we're going to need to look far beyond just working longer policies. We're going to need much more robust safety net policies. And just one more thought, and that's that in policy terms, I'd say that a recession is exactly the right time to try to improve job quality in the kinds of ways that I was outlining. That's because when workers have fewer jobs available to them, regulation that prevents employers from taking advantage of workers' desperation is, if anything, more important than in boom times.
Thank you. Susan, what's your take?
Great. Well, in a way, Beth is talking about kind of more medium-term policies or medium-term effects of policies, changing, improving the quality of jobs that will have effects on workers, need to and ability to work later in life. Ours are focused on workforce programs, right? Helping the unemployed find new jobs. There is no greater need than in a severe recession. Job separations are increasingly becoming permanent. We're not going to have that quick recovery that everyone had hoped when we initially went into the pandemic. Many are concerned, in fact, that there will be large structural adjustments, changes in employment will come in the aftermath of the pandemic, in part because we're moving to remote work. There may be additional, it may have spurred automation and the like. So there's going to be a tremendous need, as there always is during recessions, for increased workforce services. As Beth mentioned, we know that older Americans will have the most difficulty securing new employment, and because the baby boom generation in this recession is fully into those older ages, some into ages of traditional retirement. There are a lot of them. This makes it all the more urgent to make the workforce system work for older Americans.
Thank you. And so thinking through, past the pandemic, and hopefully we get out of this before too long, but what do you think about the criticism that, look, why are you looking at policies to encourage older Americans to stay in the labor market? We have loads of younger workers who don't have a job. Many of these younger workers are coming out of school with student debt. And so, let the older generation pass the opportunities on to younger workers. What do you guys think about that criticism? Susan, you want to take this first?
Yeah, let me take it first. So first, I'd like to distinguish between the short term and the medium term. We're in a pandemic. There may be reasons for older workers, for health, out of health concern, to stay out of the labor force longer. But hopefully we will be beyond this in a few months, certainly within a year. And as I emphasized, older workers, most of them, need to work for financial reasons. So if we are adopting a policy that discourages older workers from working, we need to ask, what other policies do we need to put in place? Do we need to have large-scale income supports for older workers? They will, make much greater demands on the social services that we have. This will be fiscally burdensome for everyone, not to mention difficult for them. And as I've emphasized, we have an economy that heavily relies on older workers. Nearly a quarter of the labor force is 55 and older. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, kind of the premise of the question is that there's some fixed number of jobs that we need to ration across people, right? Yeah. And that's, in sort of extreme circumstances, like a pandemic where we, need to intentionally shut down the economy, that may have, there may be some merit to that. But generally, that's not the case. Thinking of that as a longer-term policy. Older workers, the more that they earn, the more money they'll have in their pocket. They'll spend it. It'll increase our tax revenues. That's going to generate demand and stimulate the economy and generate more jobs.
Thank you. Beth, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with Susan completely on this, really. I mean, I think the fundamental point which Susan raises is that the economy is not like a single company, right? In a single company, you can easily see that if your boss retires, maybe you get to be a candidate for her job. But that's a terrible analogy for an economy. The economy is much more like a balloon. When you put more into it, it gets bigger. So the concern that there's this trade-off, I think, is misguided. I suppose what I do worry about is what happens to older workers when they have no reasonable option to retire. So about a quarter of Americans who are approaching retirement are going to rely on Social Security for 90% of their retirement income. For low-income workers, their Social Security isn't going to be enough for even a really bare bones budget. So their choice is to keep working or to retire into poverty, and that gives them very little bargaining power, which gives employers an opportunity to take advantage of older workers who don't have other good options by offering really low wages and poor conditions. And that makes working longer very difficult. So I think there's an interesting paradox here, which is that we'd actually provide, in some sense, a better support for people who want to work longer if we were able to raise the bar under retirement security for low and middle wage workers. That is, that if older workers could afford to retire, they'd actually be in a better position to look for good jobs that would help them to keep working.
Thank you. This is all really interesting. Let's pivot a bit towards the policies that you all both laid out. You both laid out a collection of really thoughtful policies that I think have a great deal of merit. And you also, in your papers, you lay out the analytical background behind the reasoning. But if you had to pick just one, and if you were sitting in front of a member of Congress or a policymaker, and they said, look, what's the one thing that we've got to do to help older workers? What's your answer? Beth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. For me, of those three, I'd say a higher minimum wage, without a doubt. Now, income is clearly not the only thing that makes a job good or bad, but it's pretty crucial. And even if you had the paid leave and the fair work week laws that I was talking about, you're still not going to be able to make ends meet on $7.25 an hour. So higher minimum wage for sure. And I think one important point here for the working longer discussion is that the typical low-wage worker is not a teenager, working at the local ice cream shop for pocket money. A lot of prime age and older workers are the people who have these very low-wage jobs. There's some estimates from just before the pandemic that suggest that about 15% of workers ages 55 and older would benefit from an increase in the federal minimum wage. So for me, the minimum wage is really where it's at. And if I were speaking to a policymaker, I'd point out that a higher minimum wage is immensely popular with voters all the way across the political spectrum. About 2/3 of Americans favor increasing the federal minimum wage to 15 an hour. And in a divided nation, that level of agreement about the importance of a policy like a higher minimum wage is really remarkable.
Great point. Susan, what's your one policy?
Well, in a way, the policies, we bundle several policies under one big umbrella, which is to take the workforce system that we have, right, the American Job Centers, and make this better, to work better for older Americans. I think one way to answer your question is to say, we could, with minimal additional expenditures, very quickly use those workforce centers to train staff to work smarter with older Americans. You know, train them in terms of the needs, work more closely with employers, you know, rethink communication methods, may be different between how you work with younger workers versus older workers, perhaps organize your job fairs differently. You know, these aren't big, sexy new programs, but they're smart ways in which the workforce system can be tailored to better meet their needs. And we've got some models with some, you know, experiments that AARP is doing in conjunction with the states to implement these. And there's an urgent need right now to make this work better for older Americans, as I've emphasized. Unemployment rates are higher. We know from all prior recessions that older workers are going to have the hardest time securing new employment. So we need to make this a priority now. Within the current system, it won't require a lot of new money. It will require a somewhat different orientation and some training of staff.
I think that makes sense. So for our final question, we don't have discussants on this panel. You know, we're adapting to this new world in which we're on Zoom and not in person. But I wonder, you know, you're both experts in this field. And I wonder if maybe Susan, starting with you, if you could maybe comment on some of the ideas that Beth laid out and just give your thoughts on the pros or cons of this approach.
Sure. As I said earlier, I think that what Beth has really nicely done is to lay out a strong case for improving the quality of jobs. Now, mostly when we hear these are not new proposals, right? Raising the minimum wage or you know, having scheduling laws and just generally you know, making work less precarious. These are not new proposals, but she's framed it in a really nice way. Because when we're talking about older workers, we often say, older Americans, we say they need to work longer. They don't have enough savings for retirement. And we can list out the reasons, but some of them, you know, a very important reason is the nature of the jobs that many particularly low educated workers hold, right? That's the fundamental problem. So I think that Beth is really addressing the fundamental problem that we face. It's not unique to older Americans, but it is, I think she's nicely pointed out, I haven't seen it said quite this way earlier, that this is very important for helping workers have enough savings for retirement.
Great, thank you. Beth, what do you think about the policies that Susan was discussing?
Well, I really enjoyed hearing and reading their proposals. And I think part of the reason that I really enjoyed them is that they are such a nice sort of complement to the kinds of things that I'm suggesting. That, you know, their broad point is that older Americans don't get the support that they need in order to successfully land a new job when they're out of work. And that's just enormously important. And the kinds of things that she's talking about too are those things where the devil and the angel is in the details. Right? That you have to be able to implement these things very well. You know, if you go into a job center as an older person, you want to feel that there's somebody on the other side of the desk who understands your issues. You know, there are like deep sort of, you know, how do you hire for those sorts of roles? How do you train for those sorts of roles? You know, and I really love that focus. I think of the, you know, sort of little proposals under their umbrella, I was really interested in the proposal to encourage job centers to support workers who want to move into self-employment. And I think self-employment is potentially really promising. Of course, as Susan pointed out, what self-employment means in real life can vary a great deal from, kind of high-powered independent consulting to, low-wage contractors and some of the platform work, which can be better or worse. And I think, there to sort of tag back to the bigger picture, we might want to think about what other sorts of policies promote self-employment. And so I'm thinking, for example, about how public health insurance can help people step into self-employment because they don't need to try to find an employer who's going to be able to provide them with health insurance. And even short of a full public health insurance option, reducing the age of Medicare eligibility to 50 or 55 would take some of the pressure off of older workers who'd otherwise feel like they need employer-based insurance. So I think, there's really a lot of promise and a lot of interest, both in the short term, things that we can do now, as Susan points out, for very little cost, and things that can be developed over time and in accordance with bigger policies.
Thank you for that. And so, now it's time to conclude, unfortunately. This has just flown by. This is really interesting. Let me just say that one of the things I love about the policies and the arguments that you've laid out is that it feels incredibly well tailored to an economy that is hopefully transitioning from a COVID-based economy to a post-COVID-based economy. But everything that you have laid out, and you both made comments to this effect throughout, is that this is very well tailored for the particular moment over the next 6 to 18 months as we transition hopefully back to a healthier economy. So let me just say thank you so much for being part of this panel and for being part of this project. For those listeners, let me say that we will release 4 papers along with this, this webinar, in addition to papers by Susan Houseman and Catherine Abraham, and then the paper by Beth Truesdale. We'll have a paper by Seth Harris, and then another paper by David Neumark. Those papers are more focused on discrimination in the labor market, but collectively these 4 papers come together to present some really fascinating, exciting new ideas for improving the lives of older workers. So thank you so much for being part of this. We're grateful and just again, thank you so much.
Thank you.